On a quiet spring day in April 1985, a hunter walking through a remote area of Elk Valley, Tennessee, made a discovery that would haunt investigators for generations. Hidden among discarded trash in an isolated dumping ground were skeletal remains belonging to a young girl. No one at the scene knew her name. No one knew where she came from. No one knew who had left her there. What investigators did know was heartbreaking. The remains appeared to belong to a child. Nearby were a few personal items, including a small beaded necklace, something that suggested innocence, youth, and a life interrupted far too soon. Yet despite the urgency of the investigation, every path seemed to end in silence. There were no missing children in the area who matched her description. No witnesses. No obvious suspects. No family searching nearby. As months turned into years, the unidentified victim became known by a simple nickname, Baby Girl. But somewhere beyond the Tennessee hills, someone had once known her laugh, her dreams, and the future she imagined for herself. The question that refused to disappear was painfully simple. Who was she? And why did nobody know she was gone? Elk Valley was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Tucked into the rolling hills of Campbell County, Tennessee, it was a small, quiet community surrounded by forests and winding back roads. There were no busy shopping districts, no crowded sidewalks, and few reasons for outsiders to visit. It was a place where life moved slowly and where serious crimes were almost unheard of. That was precisely why the discovery felt so disturbing. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found themselves facing a difficult challenge. The area where the remains were located was known locally as an informal dumping ground. Years before organized waste collection became common, residents often discarded unwanted items in remote locations far from public view. The ground was littered with household garbage, old containers, scraps of metal, discarded furniture. Among all that debris lay the remains of a young girl. Every item recovered had to be examined carefully. Investigators searched for anything that could reveal her identity or explain how she ended up there. A necklace, pieces of clothing, fragments of a shoe. Small clues scattered across a scene that seemed determined to keep its secrets. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the mystery became. Because nothing at the site suggested who she was. And no one in Elk Valley recognized her. The girl appeared to have arrived there from somewhere else. Somewhere far beyond the mountains that surrounded the valley. And that possibility changed everything. As the remains were examined, investigators turned to one of the nation's leading forensic experts, Dr. Bill Bass, and the team at the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Center. Their task was simple in theory but incredibly difficult in practice: determine who this child was. The condition of the remains told part of the story. Time, weather, wildlife, and years of exposure had erased much of the evidence that normally helps identify a victim. Yet the bones still carried clues. The victim was a white female. Young. Very young. Most estimates placed her somewhere between 10 and 15 years old. Even more puzzling was what her teeth revealed. She had received dental care, fillings, treatment, signs that someone had looked after her. This was not a child living completely outside society. She had family. She had people around her. So why wasn't anyone looking for her? That question haunted everyone involved. Investigators searched local missing person reports. Nothing matched. They expanded the search. Still nothing. A forensic artist created sketches showing what the girl might have looked like in life. Those images were distributed in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize her face. No calls came. No family stepped forward. No breakthrough arrived. Years passed and the mystery only deepened. Because the evidence suggested something investigators had begun to fear. The girl may never have been from Tennessee at all. And if she had disappeared somewhere else hundreds of miles away, the chances of identifying her in the 1980s were becoming frighteningly small. For Baby Girl, the trail was already beginning to vanish. As the years slipped away, the investigation slowly faded from public attention. New crimes emerged. New victims appeared in headlines. Leads that once seemed promising disappeared one by one. Eventually, the case was reduced to little more than a thin file sitting on a shelf. But for some investigators, Baby Girl was never forgotten. Years later, a young detective inherited the case as one of his first major assignments. When he opened the file, he was stunned by what he found. There was almost nothing there. A few records, a handful of reports, one lonely document describing the discovery of the remains. That was all. The girl without a name had become a victim of time itself. Determined to change that, the detective began rebuilding the investigation from scratch. Every report was reviewed. Every lead was revisited. Every possible missing child was examined again. Then a new tool appeared that seemed capable of changing everything: DNA. For the first time, technology offered investigators a chance to compare biological evidence against national databases. Samples from the remains were submitted for testing, and eventually a DNA profile was created. Hope returned. Maybe the answer was finally within reach. Several times investigators believed they had found her. A missing girl from another state, then another. Each possibility seemed convincing. Each one created excitement that spread through the investigative team. And every time the DNA results delivered the same devastating answer. No, not her. The case had become a cycle of hope and heartbreak. Yet despite decades of failure, one question refused to disappear. If they still didn't know who she was, how could they ever discover who had killed her? By the mid-2010s, the investigation had reached a point that many cold cases never escape. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no new evidence, and no identity. For decades, investigators had pushed every available method as far as it could go. Traditional forensic science had done all it could. The girl known only as Baby Girl remained trapped behind an invisible wall. Then a new possibility emerged. It was called forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike conventional DNA databases, which primarily compare profiles against known offenders or relatives already in the system, this technique could build family connections using distant genetic matches. In some cases, it had solved mysteries that had remained unsolved for generations. The idea sounded almost unbelievable. But there was a problem. The remains were old. Very old. Years of exposure had damaged the DNA. Earlier attempts to create the type of genetic profile required for genealogy had failed completely. Laboratories reported that the sample was simply too degraded. For investigators, the news was crushing. Once again, hope appeared only to disappear. Then came an unexpected phone call. A company called Othram had been following the case. Its scientists believed that recent advances in DNA recovery might succeed where previous efforts had failed. Even more remarkable, funding was available to support the work. For the first time in years, investigators felt something they had almost forgotten: optimism. Yet there was also risk. Every new DNA test consumed a portion of the remaining evidence. If this attempt failed, precious material could be lost forever. After nearly 4 decades of unanswered questions, they faced a difficult choice: take one final chance, or accept that Baby Girl might never get her name back. The remains were carefully transferred to the laboratory. After decades of frustration, everything now depended on a few fragile pieces of evidence that had survived in the woods of Tennessee. Scientists faced an enormous challenge. DNA is not immortal. Over time, sunlight, moisture, bacteria, and environmental exposure begin to destroy it. What was once a complete genetic blueprint becomes fragmented into tiny pieces. In older cases, those fragments can become so damaged that extracting useful information seems impossible. That was exactly the situation investigators feared. For nearly 40 years, the elements had been slowly erasing the biological evidence that might identify the girl. But Othram scientists believed they could recover information that previous technologies had missed. They selected one of the most promising samples available, a section of the mandible containing molars. From that bone, they began a painstaking process designed to recover every possible fragment of human DNA. The obstacles were everywhere: animal DNA, bacterial DNA, environmental contamination, chemical damage. Every step carried the risk of failure. Yet something remarkable began to happen. The laboratory started recovering genetic markers. Then more markers. Then thousands more. What had once appeared as an unreadable biological puzzle slowly transformed into a usable genetic profile. For the first time in the history of the case, investigators possessed enough information to attempt true forensic genetic genealogy. The profile was uploaded into databases that allowed law enforcement investigations. Then everyone waited. Somewhere among millions of genetic connections, there might be relatives who had no idea that a missing child from decades ago was about to come home. The waiting did not last forever. Within months of uploading the genetic profile, the genealogy team began seeing something investigators had spent decades hoping for: patterns, connections. A family tree was starting to emerge. Using distant genetic matches, researchers carefully reconstructed generations of relatives, tracing family lines across multiple states. Slowly, the unknown girl who had remained invisible for nearly 40 years began to take shape as a real person connected to real people. Then came the breakthrough. The genealogy results pointed toward a family with roots in Indiana. Investigators immediately began reviewing records, searching for anyone who could explain how a young girl from Indiana might have ended up in a remote Tennessee dumping site. Among the names they discovered was a man named Randy Walker. When investigators contacted him, they asked a simple question: did he have a sister who had gone missing? The answer changed everything. Yes, he did. For years, Randy had carried the pain of not knowing what happened to his sister. She had disappeared as a teenager in 1978 and had never returned home. As the decades passed, uncertainty became part of everyday life. There were no answers, no explanation, no closure, only questions. Randy agreed to provide a DNA sample. Now investigators faced the moment they had been working toward for nearly 4 decades. If the test confirmed the relationship, Baby Girl would finally lose the name that had followed her for 37 years, and regain the one she had lost. The DNA results came back. After 37 years of uncertainty, countless dead ends, and decades of unanswered questions, investigators finally heard the words they had been waiting for. It was her. The young girl known only as Baby Girl was identified as Tracy Sue Walker. Suddenly, the mystery became deeply personal. She was no longer an unidentified victim found in the woods of Tennessee. She was a daughter, a sister, a teenager with dreams, plans, and a future that had been stolen from her. As investigators spoke with Randy Walker, a picture of Tracy began to emerge. He remembered her as a happy young girl who enjoyed spending time with friends. She loved going to the mall just like countless teenagers during the late 1970s. She had ambitions. She wanted to become a hairstylist and was already practicing by cutting her brother's hair, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. Most importantly, Tracy was looking forward to her future. She wasn't drifting through life. She had goals. She had direction. She had people who loved her. Then, in 1978, everything changed. Tracy disappeared from Indiana. She was only 15 years old. For years, her family searched for answers that never came. Her parents spent the rest of their lives without knowing what had happened to their daughter. They never learned where she was or why she never came home. Now, at last, Tracy had her name back. But a far more troubling question remained unanswered. Who took her future away? For many cold cases, identification is the ending. For Tracy Sue Walker, it was the beginning of an entirely new investigation. Once her name was restored, investigators could finally focus on the events leading up to her disappearance in 1978. Information gathered from family members and local authorities revealed that Tracy had last been seen in Indiana. According to those who knew her, she had gone to a shopping mall with friends before suddenly vanishing. Then the trail went cold. No confirmed sightings. No verified explanation. No clear account of what happened next. For years, Tracy existed in two separate mysteries. One was the unidentified child discovered in Tennessee. The other was the missing teenager who disappeared from Indiana. Nobody realized they were the same person. Now those two mysteries had finally merged. Investigators began reconstructing Tracy's final known movements, reviewing old records, interviewing witnesses, and examining details that had been overlooked for decades. Every memory mattered. Every document mattered. Every forgotten conversation could hold the missing piece. The distance between Indiana and the remote Tennessee location where her remains were found raised troubling questions. How did she get there? Who transported her? And who spent decades believing they had escaped responsibility? The identification gave Tracy back her name. But it also gave investigators something they never had before. A victim they could finally know. And in homicide investigations, understanding the victim is often the first step toward understanding the killer. For 37 years she was known only by a nickname. A child without a name. A victim without a history. A mystery hidden among forgotten files and fading memories. Today she is Tracy Sue Walker. The journey to identify her required generations of investigators, forensic anthropologists, DNA scientists, genealogists, and family members who refused to give up. Many of the people who first worked the case never had the chance to see its resolution. Tracy's own parents passed away before learning what happened to their daughter. That reality remains one of the most heartbreaking parts of this story. Yet even after decades of silence, Tracy was never truly forgotten. Her brother Randy carried her memory throughout his life. Investigators continued searching long after most would have accepted defeat. Advances in science eventually accomplished what once seemed impossible. A girl lost in 1978 finally came home. But the story is not completely over. The question of who ended Tracy's life remains unanswered. Somewhere, someone still knows what happened after that day in Indiana. Someone knows how a 15-year-old girl disappeared and why her remains were ultimately found hundreds of miles away in Tennessee. And that means the possibility of justice still exists. Tracy's identification transformed a forgotten Jane Doe into a real person once again. Her smile, her dreams of becoming a hairstylist, her love for family and friends, all of it returned with her name. In the end, this story is not about technology. It is about persistence. It is about remembrance. And it is about a young girl who spent nearly 4 decades waiting for the world to know who she was. Her name was Tracy Sue Walker. And now it will not be forgotten.